On June 22, 1941, at exactly 3:15 in the morning, the largest military invasion in the history of the world began. 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front nearly 3,000 kilometers wide, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft, 750,000 horses, the most powerful war machine ever assembled, turned east and drove into the largest country on earth. Adolf Hitler had just made the decision that would cost him the war. If you want to learn English through powerful true stories like this every single day, please follow our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. The links are right below this video. Now, let us understand why Hitler made the most catastrophic military decision of the 20th century. Why he invaded the largest country on earth, knowing that Napoleon had tried and failed in exactly the same way 129 years before. And why, despite every warning, he believed he would succeed. To understand Operation Barbarossa, we must go back to Hitler's most fundamental belief. He believed in his bones, in his ideology, in his deepest conviction that the German people needed Lebensraum, living space. He had written about it in Mein Kampf, published in 1925. Germany was too small, too crowded, too dependent on imports. The solution was conquest of the agricultural lands and resources of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The Russian steppes would feed Germany. The Caucasian oil fields would fuel Germany. This was not just military strategy, it was ideology. There was a second dimension to Hitler's thinking. He was a fanatical anti-communist. He saw the Soviet Union not just as territory to be conquered, but as an ideological enemy that had to be destroyed. In his view, Bolshevism was a Jewish conspiracy. This was completely false, but he believed it completely. He called the coming war a war of annihilation, Vernichtungskrieg, not a normal war between states, a racial and ideological war of total destruction. This distinction would have horrifying consequences for millions of people. By June 1941, Germany had conquered an extraordinary amount of Europe. Poland in 1939, Denmark and Norway in 1940, France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg in 1940, Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941. The German army seemed almost unstoppable. The speed and power of German armored warfare had stunned the world. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would be the same, faster even. He told his generals, "We only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He was wrong, in a way that cost 27 million Soviet lives, and ultimately, Germany itself. There was also a strategic calculation behind Barbarossa that had some logic to it. Britain had not been defeated. The Battle of Britain had failed. Germany could not invade Britain across the Channel without naval superiority. That it did not have. The war in the West was stalemated, and America, though not yet in the war, was clearly sympathetic to Britain and providing aid. Hitler calculated that if the Soviet Union fell, Britain would have no hope of any continental ally and would be forced to negotiate peace. If the Soviet Union fell, that was the calculation. Stalin had received numerous warnings that Germany was planning to attack. British intelligence told him. His own spies told him. Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy in Tokyo, reported the exact date of the invasion. Even German soldiers, who crossed the border to defect, told Soviet soldiers on the other side that the attack was coming. Stalin dismissed all of it. He believed Britain was trying to draw the Soviet Union into the war. He believed Hitler would not be stupid enough to open a second front. He was catastrophically wrong. The German plan for Barbarossa was breathtakingly ambitious. 3 army groups would attack simultaneously. Army Group North would advance through the Baltic states to Leningrad. Army Group Center, the strongest, would advance through Minsk and Smolensk toward Moscow. Army Group South would advance through Ukraine to Kiev and beyond to the Caucasus. The plan was to destroy the Soviet army in a series of huge encirclement battles called Kesselschlachten, cauldron battles, before it could withdraw into the vast interior. The whole war was supposed to be over in 8 to 10 weeks. The opening days of Barbarossa seemed to justify the German confidence. The Soviet Air Force was caught on the ground. 2,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed in the first day alone. Soviet units were surrounded before they could react. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in the first weeks. The German advance was staggering in its speed. Within a week, the Germans had advanced 300 miles. Army Group Center was moving toward Moscow at a pace that suggested the plan might actually work. But almost immediately, the problems began. That would eventually doom the entire operation. The roads in the Soviet Union were mostly unpaved. Summer rains turned them to mud. German vehicles were designed for European roads. They began breaking down. Soviet resistance, though initially chaotic, was fiercer than expected. Soviet soldiers did not surrender when surrounded the way French soldiers had. They fought on. From the very beginning, there were signs that the Soviet Union was not France. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 was the greatest single encirclement in military history. Army Group South surrounded the Soviet forces, defending Ukraine's capital. 665,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. It was a stunning military triumph. Hitler was ecstatic, but his generals were deeply troubled. General Guderian, the master of armored warfare, had wanted to push directly to Moscow. He was ordered south to participate in the Kiev encirclement. Instead, the argument about Moscow would prove crucial. Stalin's response to the catastrophic opening of Barbarossa is one of the most documented personal crises of any wartime leader. He initially withdrew to his dacha outside Moscow for several days, apparently in shock or close to breakdown. When Politburo members came to find him, he reportedly thought they had come to arrest him for the disaster. They had not. They needed him to lead. He returned to Moscow and began the desperate reorganization of Soviet defenses. On July 3rd, he made a radio broadcast to the Soviet people, calling them his brothers and sisters. The Soviet response to Barbarossa showed something that German military planners had failed to understand. The Soviet Union had enormous reserves of human beings and industrial capacity that could be relocated beyond German reach. Within months, Soviet factories were being dismantled and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains to be reassembled and continue producing weapons out of reach of German bombs. Entire industries moved on rail cars across Siberia. Germany was fighting a country that could absorb losses on a scale no European country could match. Operation Typhoon, the attack on Moscow, finally began on October 2nd, 1941. Too late, the delay caused by the Kiev encirclement had cost Germany the summer. Now autumn was arriving. And then, in October, the rains came. The unpaved roads turned to mud, so deep that tanks sank to their turrets. Vehicles disappeared. The German advance ground to a halt. Soldiers called it the Rasputitsa, the season when roads disappeared. Then the mud froze. And something worse arrived. Winter. The German soldiers were not equipped for the Russian winter. Hitler had been so confident of a quick victory that he had not ordered winter equipment. There were no warm coats, no winter boots, no lubricants. That worked in extreme cold. When temperatures dropped to -30 and lower, German weapons stopped working. German vehicles wouldn't start. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper and took boots from Soviet corpses. The most powerful army in the world was fighting in summer uniforms, in the worst winter Russia had seen in decades. On December 2nd, 1941, German troops from Army Group Center reached the town of Khimki, on the outskirts of Moscow. They could see the Kremlin spires through binoculars. They were 27 kilometers from the center of Moscow, closer than any German soldier would ever get again. Then, the Soviet counterattack began. Fresh Soviet divisions, transferred from Siberia, well-equipped for winter, battle-hardened, under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, hit the exhausted frozen Germans and drove them back. Moscow did not fall. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 was the first major German defeat of the war. The myth of German invincibility was broken. The Red Army could fight, could win. In the same week, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Hitler, in one of his most inexplicable decisions, declared war on America. Germany now faced the United States and the Soviet Union and Britain simultaneously. The coalition that would defeat him was now fully assembled because he had assembled it himself through his own decisions. Hitler's response to the Moscow defeat was to forbid retreat. He issued the halt order, demanding that German units stand fast, wherever they were. No retreat, no withdrawal, hold your positions, or die. Some of his generals believed this order actually saved the German army from a complete collapse. If they had retreated, the frozen, exhausted forces might have disintegrated. By holding, they stabilized the front and survived the winter. But Hitler drew the wrong conclusion. He believed his willpower had saved the army. That belief would make future retreats even more catastrophic. The summer of 1942 saw Germany try again, this time not toward Moscow, but toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad was a major industrial center. It also bore Stalin's name. Hitler became obsessed with its capture for symbolic reasons. Stalin, for the same reasons, became obsessed with its defense. Two men, each willing to sacrifice enormous numbers of lives for a city that mattered more as a symbol than as a strategic objective. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, was the turning point of World War II. The German Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Paulus, was trapped in a Soviet encirclement called Operation Uranus in November 1942. Hitler forbade any attempt to break out. He told Paulus to hold as a fortress. A relief army could not break through. On February 2nd, 1943, 300,000 German soldiers who had been encircled surrendered or were dead. The undefeatable German army had suffered a defeat from which it would never fully recover. What had gone wrong? The fundamental errors of Barbarossa can be identified clearly. First, the underestimation of Soviet resilience. Hitler believed the Soviet state would collapse, like a house of cards. It did not. Second, the failure to concentrate on a single objective. 3 simultaneous drives, north, center, and south, divided German strength and prevented decisive victory anywhere. Third, the absence of clear priorities. After the initial advance, the diversion to Kiev, the delay to Moscow, the split toward Caucasus and Stalingrad, all reflected a strategic confusion at the highest level. The fourth fundamental error was the criminal nature of the war Hitler ordered. The Commissar Order instructed German soldiers to execute Soviet political officers rather than take them prisoner. This violated the laws of war. It also meant Soviet soldiers knew that surrender was not a safe option. This made them fight with a ferocity that surprised German commanders. The treatment of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war was catastrophic. 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity from starvation and abuse. These crimes stiffened Soviet resistance rather than breaking it. The fifth error was the failure to understand logistics. Germany needed to supply 3 million soldiers across distances measured in thousands of miles. The Soviet rail gauge was different from the European gauge. Every kilometer east stretched the supply lines further. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, all had to travel an ever-increasing distance to reach the front. The German army, that had advanced 300 miles in a week in the opening days, was outrunning its ability to supply itself. An army without fuel does not advance. An army without ammunition does not fight. The Soviet war effort was extraordinary in its human cost and its determination. 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war, approximately half of them civilians. This number is almost impossible to comprehend. The Soviet Union lost more people in the siege of Leningrad alone than Britain and America combined lost in the entire war. And yet the Soviet state did not collapse. It absorbed losses that would have destroyed any European country, and it kept fighting. The German assumption that the Soviet system was weak was the most expensive intelligence failure in military history. Why did the Soviet Union not collapse? Several reasons. First, the sheer size of the country. Germany could destroy the European portion of the Soviet Union, and the country would still exist and still fight from beyond the Urals. Second, the Communist Party's control of information and its ability to mobilize a population for total war. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the nature of German occupation was so brutal that even people who had hated Stalin found themselves fighting against the Germans. The German occupiers created their own enemies. The year 1943 was decisive. After Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the largest tank battle in history. Germany attempted one final great offensive on the Eastern Front to regain strategic initiative. It failed. From the summer of 1943 onward, the war on the Eastern Front was one of continuous German retreat. Slowly at first, then faster. The Soviet army was learning, getting better, getting stronger, while Germany was getting weaker with every month. The Soviet advance westward from 1943 to 1945 was unstoppable. The Red Army that had been nearly destroyed in the summer of 1941, was now the most powerful land force on Earth. It had learned from its terrible defeats. It had new commanders, new tactics, new weapons, including American supplies, provided through the Lend-Lease program. 4 million American trucks fed and supplied the Soviet advance, the Soviet army, that liberated Eastern Europe and eventually Berlin, was a different force from the one that collapsed. In June 1941, Berlin fell. On May 2, 1945, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag. Hitler was dead. In his bunker, the country that he had invaded in 1941, expecting a quick victory, had pursued his armies back to his capital and destroyed everything he had built. The war that Germany had started had ended in the complete and total defeat of Germany. The decision made on June 22, 1941, had produced exactly the opposite of what Hitler intended. Was Barbarossa always going to fail? Some historians argue that Germany came closer to success than we sometimes admit. If the Kiev diversion had not happened, could the Germans have taken Moscow in 1941? If Moscow had fallen, would the Soviet system have collapsed? These are genuine historical debates, but the broader answer is probably yes. Barbarossa was always going to fail, because it was based on a fundamental underestimation of Soviet resilience, Soviet resources, and Soviet will to fight. A war that required the Soviet state to collapse quickly was a war Germany could not win once it did not. The human cost of Barbarossa and the war it launched on the Eastern Front is almost beyond human comprehension. 27 million Soviet dead, 5 to 6 million German dead on the Eastern Front alone, unknown millions of Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Balts, and others who lived in the territory where the war was fought. The Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews and millions of others, was carried out primarily in the territories conquered during Barbarossa. No single military decision in modern history has produced more death. What are the lessons of Operation Barbarossa? First, never underestimate your enemy. Germany's contempt for Soviet military capacity and for the Soviet people's will to fight was the foundation of all its errors. Second, strategic overextension is fatal. Germany tried to do too much with insufficient resources across impossible distances. Third, wars of annihilation tend to produce the most determined resistance. When you tell people they will be destroyed regardless, they fight with nothing to lose. Fourth, even the most powerful military machine can be broken by a combination of geography, climate, and human determination. From the confidence of June 22, 1941, when 3 million Germans crossed into the Soviet Union, certain of victory, in 8 to 10 weeks, to the mud of October that stopped the tanks, to the winter that froze the soldiers in their summer uniforms, to the December counteroffensive that proved the Red Army was not broken, to the disaster of Stalingrad that cost Germany an entire army, to the failure at Kursk that ended German offensive power on the Eastern Front, to the Soviet advance that brought the red flag to Berlin. The ghost of Napoleon hung over every decision of Barbarossa. Napoleon had invaded Russia in 1812 with the Grande Armée, 600,000 strong. He had reached Moscow. He had waited for the Russian surrender. That never came. Then the Russian winter and the vast distances and the partisan resistance had destroyed his army. Only 100,000 had returned. Hitler knew this history. He reportedly said, "Napoleon made his mistakes. I will not make them." He made them anyway. The same mistakes, on a larger scale, with worse consequences. Operation Barbarossa was the decisive moment of World War II. Before Barbarossa, Germany had not been defeated. After Barbarossa, Germany's defeat was ultimately inevitable, though it took 4 more terrible years. The invasion of the Soviet Union transformed the war from a European conflict that Germany might have managed into a global catastrophe on a scale that destroyed not just Germany's enemies, but Germany itself. The decision made at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, was the biggest mistake in military history. June 22, 1941. At 3:15 in the morning, 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, the largest invasion in human history, launched with confidence that it would end in 8 to 10 weeks. It ended nearly 4 years later in the ruins of Berlin, at a cost of 27 million Soviet dead, 6 million European Jews murdered, millions more civilians and soldiers on both sides. The greatest military adventure in history had produced the greatest military catastrophe. Hitler had made his biggest mistake. Operation Barbarossa teaches us something that military history has taught over and over, and that leaders continue to ignore. The greatest military power in the world can be defeated by the determination of a people fighting for survival on their own territory. Germany had the best army, the best equipment, the best commanders, the best tactical doctrine, and it lost because it underestimated what people are capable of when everything they have is under threat. The Soviet people were not supposed to resist. They refused to follow the script, and the war ended in Berlin, not Moscow. Thank you for watching this story on Storia English. If you enjoyed learning English through this powerful story, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook page. Every day we bring you a new story from history, told in clear, slow, simple English. We will see you in the next story.